welcome again to the Amati Insights call. As usual, before we start, please do take a look at the disclaimer, which is also available on our website. Particularly note that none of today's comments constitute investment advice, so it is always important to do your own research, and if necessary, seek professional guidance. So with that said, welcome Dr. Gareth Blades to the Insights again. You've been last week at a very large industry conference at Boston, the US, met with a long list of companies. So we thought this would be a great opportunity just to get a snapshot of your current thoughts and any feedback you had on the sector. And maybe as a starting point, I know obviously the new administration, President Trump, is clearly having an impact on the sector. So it'd be good to just understand what sentiment was like around that. How should investors be thinking about it?
Yeah, I guess unsurprisingly, it was just a huge overarching theme. Just the increased level of uncertainty that Trump brings as a president, and obviously for healthcare and the healthcare sector specifically. Obviously, you have to deal not only with his daily impact, and what he kind of throws out, but there's a lot potentially changing in the sector. Not least the heads of the kind of federal agencies that help set the kind of policy agenda for US healthcare. So, the most high profile of that is RFK, Robert Kennedy. So he's coming in as Secretary of Health and Human Services, and he is, I guess, it's not controversial to say that he's very much non-establishment. And then kind of under him, you will have new heads of the FDA, which is an individual called Martin Makary, and there's Mehmet Oz, who is going to come in and run the kind of federal healthcare agencies. And these are seen as much more traditional picks, I guess, but they each have their, I guess, their non-establishment overtures. So Martin Makary coming in as FDA commissioner, he's been critical of the FDA due to the handling of COVID, and there are very close links between the agency and industry, and he sees that as too much of a conflict. And then Mehmet Oz, who's actually a TV doctor, but he's a practicing cardiologist, so he does have some credentials. He supported non-traditional medicine in the past, and obviously the kind of the gold standard of scientific evidence is clearly lacking for those kind of interventions. So when you kind of take these picks and some of the other ones as well that are coming in, they're all effectively non-conformist. So I guess the thing is it doesn't have to be seen as a bad thing particularly. What you need for great science is unbiased evidence, and that needs to be dispassionately analyzed and debated. And that way patients can get better treatments and they can get them much faster, potentially.
Yeah. And specific policies, tariffs.
Yeah, so tariffs came up quite a bit. So it was obviously it was kind of highlighted that they're already having an impact in the way that companies are curing. So it was highlighted that the EU companies are turning inwards. They're preferring EU suppliers. They're not wanting to take the chance on the US and the threat of Trump and any potential tariffs that might come their way. A couple of other things that were kind of brought up were kind of the anti-competitiveness of regulation. And this was across several sessions. And I'd not heard this before the Trump administration came in. So it's quite surprising how quickly it's kind of penetrated, the zeitgeist, the kind of sentiment of the market, and the kind of the overarching message is, the pace of innovation is slowed by regulations. And now it's viewed that there's too many of them. Everything takes too long. Whether it's planning permission to build a bioproduction plant, all the way through to drug approvals. And across every session with a company, generally there was a question about how the NIH cuts impact them.
Yeah. I mean, we obviously, a number of the companies that we invest in have had that kind of news flow. I mean, it's been a big topic. NIH, obviously, National Institute of Health. did you get any more clarity on that kind of prospects there?
Yeah. So it's very interesting actually. So they kind of range from not having any exposure at all to kind of to government grants, but there were more nuanced answers where it's apparent, and if you go back to the original announcement, it's clear that the cuts aren't actually cuts; they're a redistribution of spend. And so the kind of the impetus for this was that uh, uh, the Trump administration effectively wants to shift the amount of a NIH grant that goes to academic work, with less of it going to central kind of university costs. And they argue that's risen to too high a proportion of the overall total. And if you look back at the last audited figures for 2023, it's roughly around 26% of a total grant spend of 35 billion. So it's not an insignificant amount. Um, and what the announcement does is set a flat central cost rate of 15%. So it's a lot lower potentially. But ultimately, what you would expect to happen is that being a net benefit to companies with exposure to that spend, because more will be available to academic science rather than the cost of buildings or salaries that aren't associated with a grant. But in the short term, it's obviously likely to cause disruption, because it's enacted immediately. So for any new grants, ones that have been submitted, they'll have to be rewritten. Any grants that still require funding from here, will have that new rate imposed. Um, so really, universities will have to either cover the costs themselves, which arguably they should have been doing anyway. They could increase the amount of commercial work they do with companies. But generally speaking, from my own experience, academics are incredibly resourceful when it comes to maximizing the amount of grant funding and also how it's spent. So I think overall, short term disruption, but long term, I think it could be a net benefit.
Interesting. Yeah, that's the sort of picture we're getting from others as well. So from some of the companies that I've talked to.
Mm.
The other thing that a lot of investors are talking about now, not just in this sector, but across the market, is China. And obviously, China, they had some delays or some reduced spending, but now it seems like there are some more subsidies coming through. Did that come up? Did China come up much?
Yeah. There was actually a whole session just on US China competition in biotech and life sciences. So um, the speaker was actually the vice chair of the National Security Commission that's been tasked with um, analyzing the sector and making recommendations to government about really how the US can outcompete China in these sectors. And when they published their final report in April this year, I think you can effectively see it as a kind of biotech and life science industrial strategy, which hasn't really uh, uh, um, isn't something that the US has had previously. And the things that they're likely to prioritize are things like kind of, well, just the sector at a national level, so biotech at a national level, prioritize defense applications, and prioritize and protect biological data, which is seen as a strategic asset. And the interesting thing coming out of this session was really the palpable fear and anxiety that China was outspending and thus able to outcompete and win against the US. And it's across multiple areas. Um, and there's clear kind of defense and national security aspects to this. And interestingly, the commission was set up in the wake of COVID-19, where it became apparent how much the US is reliant on global supply chains. Just as an example of this, China is the largest exporter, with around 40% of global supply of something called active pharmaceutical ingredients. So these are kind of the raw medicines that are then made up into the formulations that we take in kind of drug form, in final drug form. So you could ask the question, and they are obviously doing this in the US, whether China would cut off supply of these if they were faced with a serious kind of geopolitical clash with the US, or might they use it as a bargaining chip in a conflict over Taiwan.
Wow. These are like the rare earths of the sciences sector.
Yes,
Yeah.
yeah,
Wow.
yeah, that's a good way of putting it. Actually, it's hugely strategically important. And it's kind of obvious that the US doesn't want to be kind of deep seeked effectively in biotech and life sciences. But unfortunately, it's probably likely that it's already happening because China has prioritized these sectors in a way the US hasn't in the last 20 years. And the kind of statistic thrown out by the chair of the session was that US R&D spending has slipped from 2% of GDP to about 0.6% more recently.
Oh,
So it's a big change. And in other areas, China kind of outspends the US, for example, in agricultural research. It's the leading patent filer. Chinese research is referenced more than US research. And you can tell that this is quite, it's hurting them. It's
yeah.
smarting. So the kind of the recommendations I think you could probably expect would be things like, obviously increased funding, export controls, tariffs, and incentives to mobilize the private sector, and going hand in hand with that, lots of deregulation.
Yeah. Yeah. That's interesting because it's if you look at the defense sector, which is obviously completely different, but the Chinese spend a lot less in USD terms than the US does, but in kind of PPP, purchasing power parity basis, they actually spend about the same. What they get a lot more bang for their buck, if you like. So
Yes.
it's interesting that this is such a big, significant issue in life sciences as well.
Yeah, yeah. I think what China has done really, really well in lots of sectors is, obviously kept costs very low. The wages are much lower in China than they are elsewhere. But what they've taken in terms of IP, they've really scaled that. Which is why active pharmaceutical ingredients are such a massive thing in China. And now they're learning from that process, and innovating beyond the people that they stole from.
Yeah, yeah. Um, Interest of time. I mean, I guess the other thing, yeah, that's top of mind for lots of investors at the moment is AI, generative AI. I imagine this was brought up quite a lot, but from your perspective, where do you see the potential from AI in the space?
Yeah, I mean, it looks like that AI is effectively being used across the kind of healthcare ecosystem, from the very earliest stages of R&D all the way through to the hospital setting. Obviously in R&D you have and I guess the unsurprising thing, is the reliance on high quality data that's required to train these models. You have that in spades at the R&D level. You have decades of protein structural data that scientists have uploaded to open source databases, in kind of good faith. Um, and that's being used by companies for commercial gain now, and generating models that can show you kind of structure prediction, and in some cases, identifying targets for drug discovery. Obviously, a kind of clear question for the academic world is, how do you police that? All of that data is open source, but it has been funded by grants and in some cases companies. So how they kind of get back on that investment is a big question for them. And then on kind of the hospital end of things, again, an area with lots and lots of data, patient data. Um, Privacy is obviously a big concern there, and you can kind of track those privacy issues at the raw data level. But when you train a model and use that, understanding what the privacy issues are much harder. So there's a certain amount of work going on at the moment where, how do you kind of prod and poke a model to understand where it could leak? personal details or something that you wouldn't want to identify a patient. So I guess the bottom line is it's being used across the healthcare ecosystem, still relatively nascent, and there's still a lot of big questions that need to be worked out for us to kind of see it in our daily lives. There's some things that are being used at the moment which it's debatable whether they're AI or whether they're just traditional machine learning, where it's kind of the automation of laborious tasks such as billing, which is obviously a bigger issue in the US. Transcribing appointments between a doctor and a patient. All of these things need to be done. Having that just done automatically saves so much time, so that a human can go and add value, to something much more worthwhile.
Right, that's interesting. Yeah, I guess that's where we're seeing it at the moment in the other sectors as well, is that kind of just improving efficiency and eliminating some of the repetitive tasks, probably.
Yes.
We're just about out of time. We've probably got another minute or so, but before the call we were talking about gene sequencing and kind of that shift. Any quick comments maybe of interest that might be of interest to investors?
Yeah, so there's a push to move sequencing, obviously, just from the research side of things into kind of clinical practice. That's kind of the promise of the sector from here, where you're exposed to large clinical volumes, which will obviously be beneficial to the companies. I mean, I think the that area hasn't lived up to the hype so far. Those machines which were purported to be clinical sequences were really brought out at a really bad time for the industry. It's gone through a cyclical downturn. Funding has dried up as well, but now it seems like that's starting to turn a corner where those machines are much more familiar. They've become they have more assays to run on them. But the critical thing to identify is what machine could be a workhorse of a clinical lab. And often the demands that a clinical lab places on a machine are different to a research lab. So for a research lab, you can wait till you've got hundreds or thousands of samples and then you run them. That's the most efficient way to do it. But in a clinical lab, you might only have tens of samples and you have to run them because the doctor needs it back within a day. So having these monstrously large machines is maybe not the way forward.
Interesting. Yeah, it'd be something worth us following up on, because it's changing very fast and has big potential impacts. We could maybe think about for another call. But for today, I think we've run out of time. So again, thank you all for joining us, and thank you, Gareth, for that. That was really interesting.
Thanks.
Yes.